Okay. A warm welcome again to everyone to the Social Theory Center's annual public event, which features our distinguished speaker for today, Professor Gargi Bhattacharya. We're very honored to have Professor Bhattacharya with us. They have published widely and wildly, I say, because of our morning session. She's been wild in the dizzying and ambitious work of rethinking racial capitalism. She's published widely in the fields of race and ethnicity studies, gender studies, in terms of class capitalism and the war on terrorism. The war on terror. Her recent monograph, Rethinking Racial Capitalism, Questions of Reproduction and Survival, is groundbreaking for redrawing or reframing the lenses of the concept of racial capitalism itself. Most recently, she has co-authored Empire's Endgame, and I've just been told that it's a fantastic book. So please go out and get that book as well. So the format for today is that Professor Bhattacharya will be speaking for about 30 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes, and then we also have with us, we're very equally honored to have with us, Dr. Siva Mohan Valuvan, who will be in conversation with Professor Bhattacharya for the next 20 or 30 minutes after that. Dr. Valuvan's recent monograph, Like Rethinking Racial Capitalism, is groundbreaking for its insights and its examination of the core and the fault line of nationalism. I promise that we're going to have, I think, a dazzling ride, which will give us much to think about and much to dream about. So I will now hand it over to Professor Bhattacharya to give this talk, Racial Capitalism, the Pandemic and the Climate Crisis, Dangerous Tactics of Differential Survival. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Goldie, and thanks to everyone at Warwick for inviting me, and thank you for attending on this hot day on another online event. I was saying this morning that when myself, Goldie and Claire had been speaking about this, we'd changed the date really with the strongly held belief that we would be able to meet in person by postponing till June. But of course, the world thinks otherwise. I truly hope that one day we are in a room together discussing this or any other matter. But I think we can make the best of it. I'm really going to try not to talk for ages, but I have some very perhaps not user-friendly diagrams. So you should just stop me at that point and say, oh, do that bit again, Gargi, or don't do it again, move on. But let me say some things and then hopefully there will be chat. Let's see. Oh, let me do it. Here we go. Oh, of course, I have to move your faces because I can't see my own. Oh, there we go. That's better. Oh, no. No, first the previous one. Okay, here we go. I'm trying to write a new book on racial capitalism. I was saying in the morning that despite struggling with what I was trying to do and the material, I think the last book I wrote on racial capitalism takes the whole book just to come to the point of asking the question. I did actually throughout it think of interspersing it with Tristram Shandy. Anyone who knows the story of Tristram Shandy, as Tristram Shandy tries to start to write his own life story, and it takes him like 700 pages, and he's just about got to the point where he's nearly born. It felt a bit like that kind of endeavor. So I'm trying to write the book that I was trying to write before, now having come to the question and clarified the question in my mind, called Mutations of Racial Capitalism. And it's worth just saying to people why I'm doing that, because it makes what I say next, I hope, make more sense. So one thing I think is the term racial capitalism can seem a little bit too easy to absorb, take up, feel like, oh, I think I know what that means. That's all fine and dandy, right? Let's move on. It's partly because that kind of racialized violence is already so much in our quite properly embedded understanding of what capitalist history has been. But despite the apparent familiarity of so many forms of racialized violence and dispossession, I really want to just hold this point that racial capitalism is not an endless replay of some primal scene of racist violence. It's not the one thing that happened that then floats through history. It's not the same thing again and again. And in fact, I think pointing to the processes of differentiation and proliferating statuses, which is partly what I think the account of racial capitalism gives us, pushes us to recognize perhaps a little bit more explicitly the adaptation of racializing techniques by different powerful actors, remade for changing contexts and capturing and also concocting new populations. So racial capitalism is not a question which says we know where everybody falls, that you will always be a devil, I will always be a victim, that I know where the colour line falls, that I know that colour is the line. It's something different about how racialized status is endlessly concocted again for economic ends. So once I tried to start thinking about how we might think of an account of racial capitalism that looks forward to the challenges that are emerging ahead of us, the question is really in which direction we think of these mutations. So already the much larger literature on racial capitalism suggests that different forms of development, whether market-led or NGO-led or World Bank-led, will never lead to economic inclusion for all, even though so much of the activity of different international institutions kind of still acts like it will be, and certainly not to varieties of standard waged work. That is not, the kind of 1960s industrial revolution of so much of the decolonized world or the Soviet 5-year plan, those kinds of things, which actually are an echo and a shadow still in how we might think of development activity. Not everyone is going to get to be that kind of standard wage worker. That's not the direction of travel. Alongside that, as we all know all too painfully, some other things are going on. So just say, this is not even an analysis, everyone knows it, that pandemic and climate crisis are resurrecting fantasies of safeguarding prosperous lifestyles for some, while at the same time relegating others to death or living death. I'll try not to go off on one, but some people in the room might, through their different arenas, be doing a training on mass organising called Workers Rising, because about 4,000 people in the world are doing it, and it seems quite a lot of people in British academia are doing it. Yesterday, the big star organiser, Jane McAlevey, was giving some slides about why we need to organise. And what she presented was a whole set of accounts in the Financial Times and other financial papers about how the luxury yacht business has been booming during pandemic, and how embarrassing that was for those who were getting rich on luxury yacht making, and also those who were kind of serving out their pandemic isolation on a luxury yacht. I thought that was, even though she's telling a different story, that's a kind of symbol of what this idea of safeguarding prosperous lifestyles for some might be. That there's a way of managing certain kinds of risk, public health risk and climate crisis risk, even the framing of them as risk, which acts as if some people will carry on having it really, really good, and the rest of us will pay the costs. And that will be a kind of solution. That some of the people are on their yachts while all over the world, ordinary people are dying. That's a kind of management of the pandemic. And of course, on online events, you don't know where people are, but everyone who's based in Britain, I think, will hear so clearly the echo of what is still being played out, whatever strange emails Dominic Cummings is disclosing today. And whatever people think of Dominic Cummings, I don't think people doubt for a moment that some version of the phrase, which one shall we not save, was not part of the discussion because it's so clearly part of the practice. So perhaps what we're witnessing is a simultaneous escalation and abandonment of development discourse. So there's high-tech solutions for some and absolute disposability for others. And when I say disposability, I mean all the ways in which some lives are rendered so less valuable that they're almost invisible, that death or living death is all that is left for I would argue, a increasing proportion of the planet. I'm already talking much too slowly. I don't know if I need to go through these key terms. This is when, in case I'm not going to go through them, I don't think, because it will take too long, but I'm just going to read through them. Actually, people could say, if they said in the chat, can I see the chat? Oh, I cannot, it might come up. Do go through that one, then I could. I'm working through these terms and I just was aware when I've been given versions of this introduction to very different disciplinary backgrounds that sometimes people don't read the same work. So I'm interested in debates about the platform economy, which are about the ways in which corporations hold information as their linchpin and then work across different segments of the economy by really tying up their ability to read data and information and siphon people and products around like that. I'm interested in indebtedness, the ways in which Lazzarato in particular talks about the creditor-debtor relation as this central social relation under neoliberalism, something that's become much more now as a whole range of low-paid work goes away. And I'll come back to that. I'm not going to say about the financialization of everyday life, because probably you all talk about that because it's Warwick and sociology. Carcerality is just another word to talk about how punishment and imprisonment comes to be the solution to all issues. Bordering, you all know, and the post-colonial wasteland, you might not know. Post-colonial wasteland is a phrase coined to talk about spaces, mainly in the global south, but could be anywhere, because the first it's the post-colonial one, but it's a way of thinking about the limits of development. The spaces that will never become part of the formal economy, and no one is trying to make them that. The spaces beyond, that can be on the edge or just relegated to being in the account, it's like will be no more than a vote bank, but maybe now we don't even believe in vote banks anymore. But again, if you need me to go back later about any of those phrases, please tell me. On the radar.
And actually, several colleagues in the UK expressed.
That was very loud. But I don't think it was a question. I think it was just an inadvertent unmuting. If it was, go back over a phrase, tell me again. Right. Okay. So what I'm trying to do is to think of racial capitalism as the emerging horizon, or horizon makes it sound good, but the emerging challenges ahead of us through these four lenses, which come from this broader literature that I'm not writing, but other people are saying all the time, this is big deal stuff in our time. The emergence of the platform as the model of how economic practice goes on, which rearranges business and commerce so that information platforms become these core methods of allocating resources without so-called waste. And we have all these interconnected services that operate in a large part through use of personal data. It doesn't feel like I need to even explain that anymore. I think everyone understands that one of the things that pandemic has done is make everything Amazon, link us into all of these kinds of interconnected ways of communicating because we can't see anyone otherwise, which then goes alongside other kinds of economic activity. The other side of that has been, I think it's not altogether decided yet, an even greater power leverage for those kinds of corporations. I mean, there's kicking back, but if you think about the ways in which platforms such as Uber, as their title says, become kind of this kind of overarching power across many forces and the aspects of our lives and our economic lives, and become despite saying they have, that none of us are their employees, have more and more different people carrying out all of these tasks for them across the driving and the Uber Eats and all the other Uberish things that you can do now. That's something to comprehend, and to then think, what does that do to the landscape of racial capitalism? Alongside that, bordering, which I think, again, people understand much more commonsensically than maybe they did 5 years ago or 7 years ago. So already pre-pandemic, we were seeing a huge ramping up of bordering activity across the world, really, including, very importantly, an outsourcing of bordering activity as a new kind of dirty industry. So just as we might, until recently, have seen richer parts of the world outsource their waste products, their dirty paper, all of the old nappies to get rid of, to other parts of the world, bordering practice, which is all of the practices by which you manage the movement of unwanted people in and out and through your spaces, that's being outsourced as a new dirty industry. We're seeing absolutely the extension of bordering machineries across the poor world as well. Of course they existed, but we're seeing much more kind of echoing between the kinds of bordering machineries in different parts of the world. And I would argue that what we think of as international relations should also now be seen as a matter of coordinating border activity. So how will we manage our mutual wish to constrain the movement of this group of people? Alongside that, indebtedness and the financialization of everyday life. I've already said, Lazzarato argues from quite some time ago, he's arguing around 2008 crash, that instead of talking about neoliberalism, we should talk about indebtedness and the ways in which being an indebted person who is always already owing and owing into the future becomes a key relation to capital, at least as important as wagedness. So that we know that all of our economic lives then become based around this managing of the value of a future life that we have to wager in order to survive. You have to assess your future risk and potential to be inserted into the economic moment of today. In this moment, when there's so much uncertainty about what work or survival will look like, whenever furlough does end, it will end eventually. Everyone who was never on furlough, the loss of huge tranches of lower paid work, what's happened to retail, what's happened to hospitality, that raises this spectre in which even greater numbers, even in quite affluent spaces, are basically living through indebtedness. And that I'm sure the people in the room know better than me that there are already many parts of the world, certainly some important Latin American work, about what happens when the managing of a debt that will never be paid starts to become the structural relation between populations and capital and populations and the state. And alongside all of that, prison. I find the prison stuff so hard to understand alongside these other things. I'm going much too slowly. We have known for some time, lots of people who talk about this stuff, that the use of imprisonment as a way of disappearing some populations alongside camps of detention is part of this kind of explicit racialized targeting. I'm very confused about what is happening to that in our time. There doesn't seem to be anything that is retreating about that carceral logic. So many things stopped during the first months of COVID, but the prison building plans didn't stop. Britain, who doesn't seem to quite know what our public sector projects would be, certainly knows that mega prisons are one of them. Again, we are not alone. So on the one hand, containment, constrainment of movement, on the other, indebtedness and platform economics. So I'm trying to just understand these things. Now, together, these things, they change the landscape of racial capitalism, not, of course, to become non-racial, but to think again about what are the processes that disperse, disaggregate and divide populations. And I've already said platform economics plus financialisation of the everyday, alongside ramped up carcerity at the border and the interior. And all those things together, I think, mess with the spatial arrangements of an earlier phase of racial capitalism. And I think the earlier phase, not that it's gone completely, but the one that seems more commonsensically apparent to us, is based on things like segregation, enclosure, and parallel but interconnected regimes of value extraction. So here's waged work, here's semi-waged work, here's non-waged work, kind of click them together. The pandemic accelerates some of those tendencies away from that. And also just raises some oddnesses, really. It transforms bordering into a public health issue. That kind of makes my blood run cold, and I'm sure, along with many others, I've had some very, very unfortunate conversations with people around that issue. You know, apparently wiping out the impact of decades of anti-borders work in popular consciousness, but only for arrivals, not departures. But after a decade of refugees welcome, after all of the uneven impact of the loss of free movement within the European Union, after really, I think, kind of unsettling for a significant portion of the population of what an endless xenophobia meant, doesn't mean we were the majority, but you know, a real unsettling after many decades when I'm thinking xenophobia was just the bread and butter of all mainstream British political life. After that shift away from that, it feels like COVID has switched that back in an instant. And bordering becomes unquestioned again. I don't know, other people could say if they think that's the case. As I've already said, pandemic also seems to wipe out some low-paid sectors and extends indebtedness far more widely and deeply, possibly opening a new arena of precarious and low-paid personal service work. You know, we've still to see, but if we look at other places where, not through pandemic, but through other kinds of really violent economic restructuring, which casts a big portion of the population out into just penury, really, and endless debt, but then becomes almost kind of a pre-industrial. There's people with money who are buying endless dirty and not dirty personal services from people who need to eat today. And that's a kind of strange characteristic of one kind of racial capitalism. And as I've already said, pandemic has absolutely accelerated platformization. Platforms have emerged as the form most readily adaptive to pandemic conditions. Come on, move on. Right, there's no way I'm going to get through everything I want to say to you. So I'm not going to say the spatial imaginary of racial capitalism. This is one of my two sets. These is too much to say to there. So I can come back to them if anyone wants to look at them. Instead, let's move on to social reproduction. If we're trying to think about how racial capitalism is changing, again, not replaying the same primal scene of dispossession again and again, even though the early dispossessions on which capitalism is formed have a long shadow. So at the one hand, there's the long shadow of what primitive accumulation proper meant and continues to kind of ripple through. And then there's also this ongoing kind of different kinds of dispossession, accumulation by dispossession, exclusion, expulsion of different kinds, that is happening in a much less predictable way, in a kind of much more innovative way. One thing that we continue to see is this tendency towards blurring the boundaries between work and non-work. And I mean non-work here, but I think everything that is not counted in the productive economy. So certainly things which are not waged, but also all kinds of different hustles, which, you know, the shadow economy, things that have to be done in order for the marketplace or the workplace to operate, but which don't get seen. One of the unexpected consequences of that is it makes the metropolis, and that's that. And I'm here using the metropolis to mean the centre of productive activity, not the particular cities. and its formal productive economy blur into the practices more akin to the periphery and the wasteland. So the wasteland is the place that will never get absorbed into the formal economy and is not supposed to, because people are relegated to disposability. They can just, you know, F off there. And the periphery is the kind of blurry bit in between. So even before pandemic, and certainly since, we're seeing kind of blurring between these three kind of, they're more like zones than spaces. They always have a blurriness between their different elements, but you know, that blurriness is greater. And most of all, that greater indebtedness and the financialization of everyday life leads to a greater mining of the sphere of social reproduction for value to take to market. Maria Mears tells this great story about this in some previous time around structural adjustment, really, and about the kind of marketization of everyday life. And she talks about the ways in which people, gives an example, I can't remember in which country, of people she's working with, who raise a certain number of goats, I think it is, for milk for their own use. The woman gets, through a development process, which is partly part of a restructuring process in their area, becomes kind of incorporated into the mainstream economy to take a debt that will allow something else to happen, allow them to buy some more goats. That doesn't quite work. It fails for one time. What happens then is that there's somehow the milk that they were previously drinking now has to be sold and taken to market to pay for the debt that they didn't need in the first place. And there's no wage being paid in any point, but somehow the work that was previously their kind of their housework, their smallholder farming, what I make, I eat, gets marketized in a way that the milk I used to drink for my breakfast is suddenly the milk that is paying my debt. And I'm incorporated into the mainstream economy with almost no leverage, not even the leverage of what being a wage earner has, but this value that was free, kind of, you know, just for me and my household before, is getting scraped into the market. Indebtedness does that in lots and lots of different ways. And maybe we could talk about that later. And I think that's scary and interesting. And in effect, those kinds of things, that difficult boundary between work and non-work, and the kind of scraping and more value from the sphere of social reproduction, looks like it's taking away some key markers of racial privilege amongst the global labour force. So things that used to mean, I'm a real human being and you are just a precarious migrant, that's kind of not so clear. You know, some of the things that used to only happen to those other people are happening to those who might have been more settled. The space of being the full economic citizen, who is a certain kind of worker, a certain kind of asset holder, a certain kind of non-indebted citizen, less and less available. And I must hurry up. Right. So clearly, some of those who've expected racialized privilege in the past now feel unsettled and angry about its loss. I think that spans across my work and Valu's work and the work in Empire's Endgame that Goldie was talking about. Just because people feel angry and unsettled about its loss doesn't mean that the racialized differentiation of racial capitalism is ending. Just because you disrupt some kinds of racial privilege, that doesn't mean that we've come to an end of racialized differentiation. So that's kind of one thing which I think might be nice to talk about. That mining of the realm of social reproduction for value is expansionary. I do think there's more of it. I think different techniques of inculcating indebtedness grab more and more of our stuff, the stuff we do to stay alive for the market. But it's not homogenizing, doesn't make us all the same. So instead of flattening economic space, indebtedness and the financialization of everyday life squat in the existing highly variegated landscape. Oh, this question, I can't remember how to say it, so I have to move you this other place. This is a whole other debate, but I'm just saying it in case anyone knows something about it, can help me. I think there's a question about how racialized logics of dispossession, which reference type, which say you're this kind of person and so you live in the wasteland you're undocumented, your family did this work for generations, you are less than me because of what you look like. You know, they're kind of dehumanization by type, inhabit the extreme atomization of a data-led economy where you are beholden to the platform because I can see you and your personalized data holding. That's a whole other story. But if anyone, I'm sure lots of people in the room know lots more about them than me, so you can say it. And as I've already said as well, bordering and carcerality are also absolutely central to our moment. Even though that doesn't seem to quite make sense to me. Trying to move the pictures around so I can see all the writing is making the slides all go around. And it's again. Right, sorry about that. Okay. So I can't see half the sentence now, so I can't remember what it is I have to say. Let me try once more. Nope. How about I pull this like this? Okay, that's better. Put it back at the bottom again. So on the one hand, we do have this implication that we're all becoming the same because we're all just data. I mean, that's kind of hidden in some of the, not only the celebratory, some of the more scary kind of dystopian accounts of the data-led economy. Or, you know, all of the categories disappear. Or if they don't disappear, they just all become as bad as each other. I can use racism, but I can use that you live in Slough. I can, you know, because I know everything about you. And what we think of as the labour market, which is where that previous segmentation of populations happened, that kind of disappears. You know, what even is the labour market in this? You know, it doesn't work for all kinds of the activity we're doing for money now. On the other, states are absolutely deeply invested in deterring and containing migration and extending the machinery of incarceration, including into schools. And both of these practices, scraping all human attention for value, as if there's no labour market, we're all just data sources, and incarcerating more and more, they recreate a version of the wasteland, because these are spaces where the productive economy kind of says, well, what even is the productive economy in those spaces anymore? And of course, and as I've already said, all of that, it kind of gives an opening for more and more fantastical thinking. I keep saying this in place, and I think, oh, is it even worth saying it? That we're living in a time when the powerful are really revealing their fantasy life to us. Sometimes I think they don't reveal it so openly, but there's something about the crises we're living through in which kind of this very unhappy and scary insight into the minds of the rich and powerful. And one of the key ones of climate crisis is survival in one or some nations. And that fantasy that we can see the planet on fire, and the way to manage that is to create a safe haven for only a small proportion of the world's population. That fantasy is reliant on ramped up bordering, enclosure, walling, incarceration. It's a way of mixing up human populations with an idea of climate threat, as if you could just pin it down and make some small spaces for luxury yacht owners safe. It's built, of course, on the absolutely willful denial of ecological interdependence. I'm not saying it's a plausible story. I'm just saying, hear it being said again and again, and try and understand what that means. And quarantine logics of pandemic both exacerbate and disrupt that logic, the idea that some can survive. We're all very scared of the planet dying, but some of us could survive. We could rally our stolen resources and quickly make sure that we and ours survive. But quarantine logics kind of both pull that quicker and take it away. On the one hand, we return to this conflation of poverty, disease, race as these interconnected symbolic moments, all which should be managed as contagion. And we know quite a lot about attempts to manage racialized contagion. doesn't come out so well. But, you know, we know how that goes. But at the same time as that quarantine logic, as if you could inoculate yourself, enclose the others, expel the others who bring that disease to you. And is the disease themselves or their poverty, or is it an actual disease? That's all of which kind of becomes interchangeable. We're simultaneously seeing a forced contraction of the economy for some, opening a greater opportunity for access for others. With the result, I fear, that the super rich may no longer be fearful that the climate crisis will get them too. So I'd like to see what other people think about that. But I think that moment when the super rich were like, oh, the World Bank will write a report, us too. Not sure. Well, anyway, I'm interested to see what people think about this. Right. So this is near the end. And I don't know. I write these tables because it helps me picture, but I don't know if it works for others. So I'll try and talk through the table, and then you should all say, didn't get any of that. I think we have still these zones of the metropolis, the periphery and the wasteland. But in the metropolis, much wage work is being made precarious. That racialized differentiation that we've had for a long time pushes some people out of work. And still, those sedimented histories of dispossession shape outcomes, both economic and health outcomes. And one of the reasons which I think, in a less commonsensical, but actually quite a kind of organically analytic way people understand racial capitalism, is because COVID shows it to them. That's what the sedimented histories of dispossession end up looking like. These people are ill, these people die, these people survive, or survive for longer. These people get healthcare, these people do not. Race is not the only marker there, but the idea that a sedimented history of inequality and dispossession then can come out in these very, very stark outcomes in the moment. Pandemic has allowed the broader population to know how to articulate that for the worst of reasons, because they're experiencing it. Alongside that, periphery. As I've said, that zone feels like everything is the periphery now. Tiny group of people still thinking, oh, I'm getting kind of quite regular work, and then the periphery expands and blurs. So there's this huge increase of dangerous and precarious work, and I think we ain't seen nothing yet. I fear that the next 10, 20, 30 years will see a massive increase of more dangerous and precarious work. And depending, I don't know what people's backgrounds are here or where you know, but think of any of the mega cities of the global south, and then imagine what retail, leisure, financial economy, urban centre in the global north post-pandemic will look like. And I think we can start to imagine what the possible iterations could be. And then the wasteland, which has always been with us, but it can expand to get more and more disposable people in, is absolutely increasingly subject to militarized violence and containment. Look at the ways that bordering is much more openly militarized. It was always militarized, but now it's kind of a celebration of the militarization of bordering across many different zones, including in the poor world, uncountable deaths. That's why there's so many border projects which just try to literally count and name who died. Who are the bodies in the desert? Who are the bodies in the sea? We can't even count that now. That's what disposability means. But across those three changing zones, we also have this remaking of a highly variegated and almost global arena of value scraping from an array of non-work activity. And why it goes across the three zones is because that doesn't matter if you're a nearly full economic citizen or a disposable nearly non-person, because those kinds of value from data and platform engagement, they're not so located and they move across the zones. So this is populations as data, with data here as a tool of economic positioning, but perhaps not a determinant, or it's not clear to me yet what's happening there. Maybe we need to see that play out some more. And alongside that, so everyone's becoming data, but also the zones are kind of shifting, and the bottom two are expanding, so there's only a tiny metropolis. We see in that contraction of the metropolis a small productive labour force, probably was going to get smaller, with an army of low-paid personal services, I'm guessing. Some of that's already happening. Some of it happened through pandemic, didn't it? Plus escalated policing of the necropolis in the metropolis. Necropolis is a word to say that some of those aspects of the wasteland, the economics of death, the economics of crime, the violence that accompanies those illicit economies, that lives in the metropolis as well. Yeah, that's why before pandemic you'd have very nice but quite affluent white people being interviewed about their neighbourhood at somewhere in London, about how can it be that these other youngsters are being killed in the street by each other, apparently. What's going on? That's because necropolis and the metropolis, they live alongside each other, and actually the necropolis services the metropolis. As I've already said, there's this expanding and variegated periphery, which has blurred boundaries on both sides, with both the metropolis and the wasteland, but increasingly consists of very uncertain forms of the precarious economy, even more precarious than the personal service work over here in the kind of metropolis, and that services the metropolis but through insecure routes. It's not even as good as being someone's maid, but all the ways in which the services that the metropolis needs come through, and some of that is about documented status or undocumented status. Some of it is about all the ways in which some lives are made endlessly dangerous, and indebtedness is part of that. If my life is precarious in a way that if I can't get this particular gig this Friday, I have to then run around and hide because someone else says they're going to break my legs because I was meant to get something to me last Thursday, that's an insecure route. And you need to think about I need to think about what that does to the space of racialized differentiation and just our ability to think of justice. And the wasteland shows us a kind of different residue of militarized tactics. Forced displacement, absolutely, people being pushed out, but also forced stasis. All of the encampments that, again, in the last 20 to 30 years, we've seen crop up and then be razed to the ground again. That's part of the wasteland, to say, you can't stay here, but you can't go anywhere else. So, you'll stop at some junction or some border or some coastline because there's nowhere else for you to go. And that space is very much beyond the law. And that is miserable as anything, which is not how I like to leave it. But I hope there's some questions or chats we might have in that. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Gargi, for that really rich and probably very astute predictions of our future.